Welcome to this deep dive. We take stacks of information, pull out the key nuggets, and basically give you a shortcut to being really well informed. Today, we're plunging into something, well, incredibly fundamental. This invisible architecture of rules, norms, laws, the stuff that really functions as the operating system for us, for humans. This deep dive is built on an AI-driven scientific analysis, a big multidisciplinary look at how these rules shaped our past, how they govern our present, and actually how they hold the key to a sustainable, prosperous future. So our mission today is to give you a kind of universal framework for understanding how all these rules work, from their deep biological roots right up to their global impact, and hopefully with enough surprising facts and, genuine conversation to keep you hooked.
Yeah, what's really striking is how this analysis treats rules not just as abstract ideas, but as a living, evolving system. We'll explore how they subtly affect everyone, regardless of background or culture, and why they're not just helpful, but absolutely essential for our survival and progress. Really fundamental.
That's a powerful way to put it. A living system. Okay, so where do we even start trying to unpack this whole system of rules?
The foundations of order. What rules are and why we need them.
Well, the AI's model presents them as this complex, multi-layered thing, almost like a normative stack, they call it. Right at the base, you've got social norms. These are the informal, often unwritten rules. They define what's acceptable behavior in a group. Think of them as the unspoken kind of social GPS guiding our daily interactions. We absorb them basically from infancy. And they're enforced by everything from, a subtle look of disapproval to maybe even being excluded from your reference group.
Right. And what's really insightful here is the distinction the analysis makes between descriptive norms and injunctive norms. Descriptive is what people actually do, like you see a clean park, you assume people don't litter. But injunctive is what people approve or disapprove of. So seeing someone pick up trash sends a signal. Littering is definitely frowned upon here.
Exactly, yeah. And that distinction helps us understand some really fascinating things like pluralistic ignorance. That's where, most people in a group might privately disagree with a norm, but they go along with it anyway because they mistakenly think everyone else actually supports it.
Oh, like that awkward work meeting scenario, where everyone nods along to a bad idea.
Yeah, precisely. But inside, almost nobody agrees. That's it, in action. And the power of these subtle norms, it's everywhere. Governs everything from table manners to, well, even things like gender roles. Okay, so moving up that stack, we find moral rules. Now, these are still social norms technically, but they represent society's most deeply held principles of right and wrong. They're often internalized much more deeply, supported by powerful emotions like guilt and shame. Those act as internal brakes, Things like prohibitions against killing or stealing, often seen as pretty universal. They form the ethical bedrock, really. And then right at the very top of this normative stack, you get legal rules, or simply laws. These are formally approved by a state's legislative body, enforced by a controlling authority, think courts, police with clear penalties if you violate them.
Right, and that formal state-backed enforcement, that's the key difference, isn't it? Between laws and those informal social or moral norms. We're talking statutes passed by parliaments or Congress, detailed regulations from agencies, maybe even case law from judges in common law countries. That formal structure gives a clarity, a predictability that you just don't get with informal norms.
And this raises a really crucial point the analysis highlights. What happens if a law doesn't have that underlying support from social and moral norms? Well, it becomes incredibly difficult and expensive to enforce. It ends up relying mostly on just coercion, force.
Like prohibition in the U.S.
The classic example.
Yeah.
A formal law that ultimately failed because it just didn't mesh with what a lot of people actually accepted or believed. But on the flip side, strong shifts in social norms, think about civil rights, for example, often drive the creation of new laws. So it's a dynamic system, constantly evolving.
So you have a deeply felt social norm. Maybe like discrimination is wrong. It becomes an internal moral principle. Then, as society gets too big for just social pressure, it gets written into formal law to protect everyone. Understanding that interplay. Yeah, that seems vital for making laws that actually work. Okay, so we've defined rules. Now, the bigger question, why do we even need them? The deep dive into our source material points straight to social contract theory.
Right. This theory basically says that people implicitly, or sometimes explicitly, agree to give up some of their individual freedom. They hand it over to an authority in exchange for security and order. This allows society to actually function and, flourish. It's presented as a rational trade-off for mutual benefit.
Because the alternative, well, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes famously painted a pretty grim picture of the state of nature. He called it a dreadful place to live. He described it as, what was it, continual fear and danger of violent death, life being solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Basically, a constant state of conflict, right?
Exactly. A dog-eat-dog world, essentially. No room for commerce, culture, just survival. So, to escape that chaos, Hobbes argued, rational individuals agree to a social contract. They submit to a strong central authority to guarantee peace. But while others agreed we need a contract, they argued about the terms. John Locke, for instance. He argued government's main job is to protect our natural rights, life, liberty, property. And its legitimacy comes purely from the consent of the governed, if the government breaks that trust. Locke said the people have the right to set up a new one.
Okay, so a different emphasis there.
Definitely. And then you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He believed a legitimate state has to be guided by the general will, meaning citizens agree to laws that reflect the common good. For Rousseau, true freedom wasn't just doing anything you want. It was found in obeying laws that the people themselves collectively agreed on.
Now, if we connect this back to the AI's analysis, that state of nature Hobbes described, it sounds exactly like a game theory scenario where being selfish, defecting, is always the winning strategy for the individual. And evolutionary biology shows that for cooperation to work on a large scale, you need mechanisms to stop that from happening.
Precisely. Things like direct reciprocity, I scratch your back, you scratch mine, or indirect reciprocity, which is more about reputation. So the social contract, viewed this way, is like the big society-wide institutionalization of these cooperative mechanisms.
So laws against theft are basically rules against defecting in the game. Courts are the impartial referees. Constitutions are the rule book for this whole cooperative venture.
Exactly. It reframes that whole philosophical debate. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, they were essentially proposing different risk management strategies for this big societal bargain. Hobbes was worried about total breakdown, Locke about protecting individual freedoms, Rousseau about collective stability. And our modern politics, it's still largely about negotiating those same trade-offs.
Okay, so if the social contract is the why, then the rule of law is the how. The principles for making it work fairly and effectively. It's this idea of a durable system where nobody, not even the government, is above the law. It's the foundation for functioning democracies and, well, prosperous economies, too.
The World Justice Project identifies 4 key principles here, which the analysis really emphasizes. 1. Accountability. Everyone, including the government itself, is accountable under the law. No exceptions. 2. Just law. The laws themselves need to be clear, public, stable, applied evenly, and they must protect fundamental human rights. 3. Open government. How laws are made and enforced needs to be accessible, fair and efficient, transparent processes. And 4. Accessible and impartial justice. Justice needs to be delivered promptly by competent, ethical, independent people.
And the real-world impact of getting this right. It's huge, isn't it? The analysis makes it clear. Countries that adhere better to these rule of law principles, they consistently show higher economic growth, more peace, better education levels, even longer life expectancy.
The reason seems pretty clear. It creates stability and predictability. It protects property rights, ensures contracts are enforced, reduces risk for everyone, individuals, businesses. It encourages investment. On the flip side, a weak rule of law, where things are arbitrary, maybe corrupt, that scares off investment, and sadly, it always harms the most vulnerable people the most.
If you think about this cognitively, that Hobbesian state of nature, it's not just physically dangerous, it must be mentally exhausting. You'd be constantly scanning for threats.
Right.
Using up huge amounts of mental energy just trying to stay safe.
Absolutely. And this is where the rule of law acts as this massive cognitive offloading mechanism. That's a great way to put it. When laws are clear and stable, you don't waste brain power guessing the rules or fearing arbitrary decisions. You can actually plan ahead. When justice feels impartial, you trust the system to handle disputes. You're not spending energy plotting revenge or constantly watching your back.
So it frees up mental resources.
Exactly. It liberates that cognitive energy, allows it to be redirected from just surviving towards, well, innovation, business, art, science, all the things that drive human progress. And when the rule of law breaks down, that cognitive tax comes right back and progress stalls. It's a direct link.
The genesis of rules, biological, psychological, and historical origins.
Okay, so we've got the what and why of rules down. Now let's dive into the really fascinating science behind them. Where do they actually come from? Thinking about our evolutionary past, our psychology, our history.
Well, the very existence of human society, especially large-scale cooperation, is a huge evolutionary puzzle. I mean, if natural selection rewards selfishness, why are we so cooperative? Logically, defectors, the selfish ones, should always win out and drive cooperators to extinction over time.
Right. But the AI analysis offers a resolution, doesn't it? It points to 5 key mechanisms that actually allow natural selection to favor cooperation. These are like the biological foundations of our morality and our rule-based lives.
Exactly. First up is kin selection. Basically, altruism can evolve if helping a relative increases the chances of shared genes being passed on, even if it costs the individual helper.
Explains why parents sacrifice so much and why we tend to help close family. Makes sense.
Second, direct reciprocity. Simple, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. This works well in repeated interactions, building trust between people who aren't related. Third, and this one's crucial for larger groups, is indirect reciprocity. This is more like, I help you and someone else helps me later. It's all about reputation. Helping others builds your reputation as a good cooperator, making it more likely that others will help you down the line, even if they haven't interacted with you directly before.
And that sounds like it requires some serious brain power, right? Keeping track of who did what, who's trustworthy, telling others about it.
Huge cognitive demands. Monitoring, remembering, communicating reputations.
Yeah, and it's widely thought that this pressure, managing these complex social reputations, was a major driving force behind the evolution of human intelligence itself. And language, too,
Yeah.
especially for, well, gossip.
Absolutely. Gossip as an information-sharing tool about social reliability. And it drove the development of social norms to manage all this. Fourth mechanism, network reciprocity. Cooperators can thrive if they form clusters in social networks. They interact more often with other cooperators within their cluster, reinforcing cooperation locally. And fifth, group selection. This is the idea that natural selection can operate at the group level. A group composed mainly of cooperators might simply outcompete a group of selfish individuals.
Wow, so human society is unique because we've somehow managed to use all 5 of these mechanisms at the same time and then amplify them massively through culture. We use kin selection with family, direct reciprocity with friends, networks and communities, group selection in companies or nations.
Exactly. And most significantly, we've absolutely supercharged indirect reciprocity using cultural tools. Language lets us track reputations far beyond our immediate circle. Written laws and contracts create binding agreements between strangers. Digital platforms now provide global reputation systems, like online reviews.
Okay, so this is a really key takeaway from the analysis then. Our complex systems of laws and norms, they aren't just arbitrary inventions. They're sophisticated cultural adaptations, kind of evolved tools designed to create and enforce the conditions where these 5 biological drivers of cooperation can work on a massive scale.
Precisely. So a good law, from this evolutionary viewpoint, is one that effectively strengthens one or more of these pathways to cooperation.
So that biological drive for cooperation needed the right mental software, too. A rule-following mind, as the analysis puts it. Let's dig into the cognitive and emotional side.
Well, evidence suggests humans might have an innate sort of impulse to follow rules. Even very young children seem to get it. Studies show toddlers understand that rules shouldn't be broken, and they actually seem to prefer rule-governed behavior, even when it's frankly inefficient.
Ah, like those experiments where you show a toddler a really roundabout, rule-based way to get a toy, like tapping a box 3 times first.
Exactly. The toddler will often slavishly copy the whole ritual, whereas a chimpanzee, it'll just ignore the pointless steps and grab the toy directly.
Huh. So that strong tendency for social learning, for conformity, it's actually super efficient for us, isn't it? For circing up complex culture.
Incredibly efficient. It lets us inherit pre-existing solutions of wiser others, as the source puts it, without reinventing everything from scratch. Now, this rule-following mind needs some complex cognitive machinery. We have to detect which norms are active in a situation, apply them to ourselves, monitor if others are complying. And when we think about breaking a rule, our brain actually shows a cognitive conflict. It activates pathways for both following the rule and violating it. We deliberate, and that deliberation is shaped by our mental shortcuts, our schemas, which can sometimes lead to biases, of course, and to enforce these rules internally. Evolution gave us some powerful social emotions: guilt, feeling bad about what we did wrong; shame, that painful feeling of being devalued by others. Both act as strong deterrents against breaking rules.
Then on the positive side?
Pride, when we act properly according to the rules; loyalty to our group. These encourage cooperation. Charles Darwin himself remarked on how deeply ingrained these social rules are, even for seemingly minor things like trifling rules of etiquette.
So rules aren't just about stopping bad behavior. They also meet fundamental psychological needs, right? Like providing structure.
Yes, exactly. That structure creates predictability, which helps us manage anxiety, gives us a sense of order. And thinking deeper, How do rules connect to needs like autonomy, competence, relatedness, the core needs from self-determination theory? Well, a well-designed rule system actually supports all three. It can foster well-being and intrinsic motivation, making people want to follow the rules.
And this seems like a big but. What about when rules feel rigid, arbitrary, controlling? The source calls them should rules, maybe learned in childhood or from trauma.
That's the crucial flip side. Those kinds of rules can be profoundly harmful. They crush our sense of autonomy, they can override our authentic values, and lead straight to anxiety, depression, or even defiance breaking rules just to feel some control.
So there's this fundamental tension.
Absolutely. Between our need for structure and safety and our need for autonomy and self-expression. Finding the right balance is key for individual well-being and for societal health, too. Authoritarian systems use fear, crushing autonomy. Healthy systems provide clear guidance, but they also explain the reasons for rules and allow for choice where possible. This fosters internalization. It helps turn external rules into personal values. That's really the essence of developing moral character.
And that directly answers the question of how to raise healthy kids, doesn't it? Clear, consistent rules, but also explaining the why and giving age-appropriate choices to build that autonomy.
Exactly. And the same logic applies society-wide. A just state creates laws people see as legitimate, fostering voluntary compliance, not just grudging obedience.
Okay, so our rule systems weren't always like this. Let's look at the history. The deep dive shows it's tightly linked to technology, economics, and just how big societies got.
For sure. For most of human history, we lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers. Small bands, pretty egalitarian. Rules existed, but as customary law. Unwritten traditions, norms, taboos, enforced through social pressure, gossip, maybe ostracism. Order came from close personal ties.
And then came the Neolithic Revolution, around 10,000 BCE. Agriculture changed everything.
Completely. Permanent settlements, population growth, the first towns. Suddenly you have private property land, stored food. Social hierarchies start forming. All this demanded new, more formal rules for property rights, inheritance, contracts, even taxes to support emerging leaders or projects.
And as societies got bigger, more anonymous, just relying on gossip and social pressure wasn't enough anymore.
Right, and that's where the next huge technological leap came in. Writing. Around 3500 BCD in Mesopotamia, writing was as transformative for law as agriculture was for society. It made rules permanent, objective, scalable. This led directly to the world's first written legal codes.
Like the Code of Hammurabi in Babylon around 1772 BCE, that famous stone pillar.
That's the most famous one. 282 laws, very specific if-then format. Covered commerce, family law, crime. But importantly, these early codes also clearly reflected the hierarchical nature of those societies. Punishments often vary drastically based on your social class, sometimes brutally so.
And from those ancient roots, different legal traditions branched out.
Exactly. Roman law, for example, became the foundation for the civil law tradition, which is common across much of Europe. It's characterized by comprehensive written codes or statutes. England, on the other hand, developed the common law tradition after 1066. This relies more on judicial decisions, on precedent rulings that became common across the kingdom.
And then another massive shift with the Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Huge shift. Thinkers like John Locke, Montesquieu, championing ideas like natural rights, separation of powers, government based on reason and consent. These ideas directly inspired modern democratic constitutions, like the one in the United States.
So this whole historical arc really shows that legal evolution is driven by changes in technology and society.
Absolutely. Every major innovation, agriculture, writing, the printing press, the internet, creates new ways for people to interact. That creates new opportunities for cooperation, but also new kinds of conflict. And those new situations demand new rules. The legal system is fundamentally reactive, trying to catch up.
So the takeaway for us today, if you want to understand where law is heading, look at where technology is heading.
Precisely. The big legal debates now, and for the foreseeable future, are going to be dominated by how we regulate things like AI, genetic engineering, global digital platforms, and our relationship with the environment itself.
The system in action, the pervasive impact of rules.
Okay, so rules aren't just concepts. They're active forces shaping our lives, from our inner world to global dynamics. This part of the deep dives looks at that pervasive impact.
Right. And the most intimate impact is on the individual. The rules of your family, your school, your society, they form the basic architecture for your development. They shape behavior, psychology, well-being. And this analysis actually offers a pretty clear picture of what the best scenario looks like for raising a healthy, educated, good child.
Stability and safety seem key for kids. Predictable rules provide that security, which is essential for healthy attachment, learning social skills, whereas inconsistent rules, that could actually normalize rebellion, couldn't it? Or create a lot of anxiety.
Definitely. Rules are the main way we teach behavior and social skills. Clear expectations paired with positive reinforcement, not just punishment, build self-esteem and motivation. Through this, kids learn basic pro-social stuff. Sharing, respecting property, understanding boundaries. But the nature of the rules really matters for long-term psychological health. Societal norms, especially around things like achievement or appearance, can put immense pressure on people, leading to stress, anxiety, depression. And for people who've experienced childhood trauma, sometimes rule breaking itself becomes a coping mechanism, a way to reclaim some sense of control maybe, or rebel against a world that felt unjust.
And those rigid internalized should rules we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
they can be really toxic, right? Like having a constant inner critic judging everything you do.
Extremely toxic, generating guilt, overriding your own authentic needs and feelings. It's a recipe for distress. So putting it all together, the analysis points to this best possible scenario for raising kids as being about finding that dynamic balance between structure and autonomy. That means providing safety and stability with clear, consistent rules, yes, but also fostering internalization, not just obedience, explaining the reasons behind rules, linking them to values like fairness, empathy. We don't hit because it hurts people and we want to be kind.
Right, not just because I said so.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
supporting their needs for autonomy and competence by offering age-appropriate choices within that structure. Red shirt or blue shirt, not just wear this. Also, modeling the behavior you want to see: honesty, compassion. Kids learn so much by watching. And finally, building self-esteem with positive feedback for effort and good behavior, not just focusing on punishing mistakes.
It's like the external rules act as a temporary scaffold for the child's developing brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, the part for impulse control, moral reasoning. And the goal is for the child to gradually internalize that scaffold, moving from I follow rules to avoid getting in trouble to I follow rules because it's the right thing to do. That's building character.
Beautifully put. And you can see how this extends beyond parenting. The criminal justice system often deals with folks where that internalization process went wrong somehow. Approaches like restorative justice, which focus on repairing harm and fostering empathy. You could see those as attempts to help rebuild that internal scaffolding, rather than just adding more external punishment.
Okay, shifting to the group level. Rules seem to have this powerful dual role. They bind communities together, creating identity, but they can also drive conflict between groups. How does that paradox work?
Well, rules in the broad sense, laws, religious doctrines, moral codes, even just etiquette, they're the defining markers of a culture. Following your group's norms signals belonging, loyalty, trustworthiness. It forms the bedrock of cultural identity.
But the very same process that builds that us feeling can fuel hostility towards them, the outgroup.
Precisely. Social identity theory explains this well. We naturally categorize into us and them. This often leads to in-group bias, prejudice, discrimination. Conflict becomes more likely when the outgroup is seen as some kind of threat. Now, that threat could be competition over resources, land, jobs, whatever. That's realistic conflict theory. But conflict can get even more intense, often much more intractable. When the perceived threat is to the in-group's identity, its values, its way of life, that's when rule systems directly collide. Beliefs about superiority or feeling deeply wronged or vulnerable, those are powerful fuels.
And this gets to that disturbing question. Why do humans sometimes break their own fundamental rules, like don't kill, to attack other groups or cultures?
When an outgroup gets framed as an existential threat, a threat to the very survival or core values of the in-group, something psychologically shifts. The in-group's moral rules can get mentally restoked, so they only apply to other in-group members. The outgroup gets dehumanized, cast as fundamentally other, which neutralizes those moral breaks against violence.
So attacking the other culture isn't seen as breaking the rules anymore.
It's tragically reframed as defending the rules, defending our way of life against this perceived threat. This is the dangerous psychology behind things like xenophobia, ethnic cleansing, holy wars. It's chilling.
Yeah. And it's often wrong to see these conflicts as just chaos or lawlessness. More often, it's a clash between two distinct, highly ordered, rule-governed systems. The most dangerous conflicts erupt when one group's core norms are seen as fundamentally incompatible with and threatening to another's. That desire to get rid of other cultures is, in a dark way, an attempt to eliminate a competing normative framework.
So what's the path toward mitigating that? It sounds like it needs more than just negotiating over resources. The analysis suggests it requires finding or creating superordinate goals and superordinate identities, shared objectives, a sense of common purpose or identity that can override those conflicting group loyalties. This is really the driving principle behind things like international law, efforts towards universal human rights, trying to build some shared normative ground where different groups can coexist, even if they disagree on other things.
Now let's broaden the scope again. Our rules also define our relationship with the natural world. And historically, that relationship, legally and economically, has been pretty one-sided, hasn't it? Treating the planet mostly as resources.
Overwhelmingly so. And that foundational rule, nature is resource, nature is property, it drove incredible industrial growth, yes, but it's also pushed us into a massive ecological crisis. It's forcing us to rethink our most basic assumptions. Dominant Western legal traditions largely codified this view. Nature as objects without rights that can be owned, used up, destroyed, reflecting that old philosophical idea of human dominion over the earth.
And the results are all around us. Climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and even our environmental laws often just seem to regulate how much harm is allowed, right? Not stopping it entirely.
Often, yes. They effectively legalize a certain amount of environmental damage. It's regulating the exploitation, not fundamentally questioning it. But in response to these failures, a really transformative movement has emerged: the rights of nature. This directly challenges that property framework. It argues that ecosystems, species, maybe Earth itself, are living entities with inherent rights, the right to exist, to persist, to regenerate their vital cycles.
And the legal innovation here, flagged by the analysis, is granting legal personhood to nature. Like a corporation is a legal person.
Exactly. So a river, a forest, an ecosystem could be recognized as a legal entity with the right to have its interests represented in court. Human guardians can then sue on its behalf to protect its rights.
And this isn't just theory.
Not at all. Ecuador put rights of nature in its constitution back in 2008. Dozens of legal cases have been brought since then around the world. Rivers in New Zealand, Colombia, and this approach resonates deeply with many indigenous legal traditions, which always saw nature in terms of relationship and kinship, not just property. So think about the direct impact of that fundamental rule choice. Nature as property versus nature as a rights-bearing entity, a property-based system. It incentivizes things like industrial agriculture that depletes soil and water because the focus is short-term profit from the property. But a system recognizing the rights of the soil itself, it would demand a shift towards regenerative agriculture that nourishes the soil.
Yeah, waste.
Under a property system, waste is often an externality, someone else's problem to deal with. But if nature has rights, you're forced towards a circular economy, minimizing waste, recycling resources, because you can't just dump your problems onto a rights-bearing entity.
This sounds like it requires evolving our most basic rule system, the social contract itself.
That's exactly how the analysis frames it. The original social contract was between humans to escape the chaos they created for each other. Now we face a new kind of state of nature, a planetary one, of our own making, driven by ecological chaos.
So the rights of nature movement is like trying to forge a new, expanded social contract.
Yes, one not just among humans, but between humanity and the planet. Just like the original contract meant giving up some individual freedoms for a collective human order, this new contract implies humanity needs to give up its assumed absolute freedom to extract and pollute in exchange for planetary stability and survival. It's arguably the most profound rule change we've ever faced, a necessary update to our species' core operating system.
Engineering a better future, a framework for normative improvement.
Okay, we've covered the what, why, where from, and the huge impact of rules. This deep dive now leads to the ultimate question. How do we actually engineer better ones? How do we improve this system?
Well, the analysis argues strongly that improving rules requires a solid method for evaluating them first. And no single viewpoint is enough. You need an integrated framework, one that combines procedural fairness, how the rule is made and applied, with substantive ethical considerations, what the rule actually does. Any proposed rule needs to go through this kind of multifaceted check. First hurdle, procedural justice. Does the rule meet those basic rule of law standards? Is it clear, public, stable, applied fairly to everyone? Does it respect basic rights like due process? A rule that fails this first test, no matter how good its intentions might seem, is inherently flawed and likely unjust.
Okay, so if it passes the procedural test, then what?
Then it faces a three-pronged ethical analysis, drawing from major philosophical traditions to get a rounded view. First, utilitarian analysis. This focuses on outcomes. Does this rule actually produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people? This demands a careful, evidence-based look at potential consequences, weighing the benefits against the costs.
So does it work, basically, for most people?
In essence, yes. But then second, deontological analysis acts as a vital check on pure utility. This focuses on duties and rights, not just outcomes. Does the rule respect the inherent dignity and rights of all individuals, even minorities? Could its underlying principle be applied universally without contradiction? This stops the tyranny of the majority, making sure fundamental principles aren't trampled for the sake of overall benefit.
So it protects individual rights even if it's slightly less efficient overall?
Potentially, yes. It sets boundaries. And third, virtue ethics analysis. This looks at the long-term impact on character. What kind of people does this rule encourage us to be? Does it cultivate virtues like honesty, compassion, responsibility? Or does it maybe unintentionally foster vices like greed, selfishness, apathy? It looks at the moral trajectory of the society shaped by the rule.
So combining all four, procedural justice, consequences, rights, and character, gives you a pretty robust way to evaluate a rule.
Exactly. A rule that scores well across all four is likely to be just, effective, and sustainable. If it fails badly on one or more, it needs serious rethinking or rejection. And here is something else the analysis really stresses. The quality of the rules is totally tied to the quality of the rule makers. You can have the best framework in the world for making laws, but if the leaders implementing it are incompetent or corrupt, it's useless.
So a culture that wants good rules also needs a culture that's good at selecting leaders capable of making them.
Precisely. It needs to design its leadership selection process to identify people with the right characteristics for just and effective governance.
Which means moving away from systems that just prioritize, say, wealth or charisma or just loyalty to a party.
And moving towards systems that genuinely value demonstrated competence and, crucially, character. From a virtue ethics angle, you'd look for leaders with prudence, practical wisdom, trustworthiness, intellectual honesty, courage, moral and physical, a strong sense of justice. From social contract theory, leaders need legitimacy, commitment to the consent of the governed, the common good. From the rule of law view, they must see themselves as servants of the law, holding themselves and others accountable.
So what would a culture actually design to pick leaders like that look like? What needs to change?
The analysis points to reforming core institutions. First, civic education. It needs to actively cultivate civic virtue, critical thinking, understanding good governance way beyond just memorizing facts. Second, electoral process reform. We need systems that deliberately reduce the corrupting influence of money and amplify signals of actual competence and character. Think public financing, maybe longer, more substantive debates, independent vetting bodies. And third, fostering an informed electorate. We need a media and public sphere that values evidence and integrity over just tribalism and emotion. And actively teaching people about the cognitive biases that make us all vulnerable to propaganda and misinformation.
Because the election system itself is a set of rules. And like any rules, they incentivize certain behaviors.
Exactly. If the rules of the political game reward negativity or wealth or manipulation, that's the kind of leader you'll tend to get.
So to get better leaders, you have to change the rules of the game itself. Make wisdom, integrity, competence the winning strategy. Okay, so this whole deep dive, drawing on the AI analysis, seems to reveal this underlying human algorithm for a thriving society. What are the key recommendations for actually engineering that better future?
Right. The source concludes with some core recommendations. First, refound education on the principle of internalization. The goal shouldn't just be obedience, but producing self-regulating citizens who follow rules because they believe in the shared purpose and justice behind them, not just out of fear. That's the bedrock of long-term social cohesion. Second, adopt that integrated framework for making laws. Systematically vet proposed rules using consequences, rights, virtue, and procedure, and consciously design laws to strengthen those biological cooperation mechanisms and support our psychological needs. Third, evolve justice systems beyond just punishment. Embrace restorative principles, focus on repairing harm, fostering dialogue, reintegrating people. Address the root causes of rule breaking, don't just manage the symptoms. Fourth, actively engineer intergroup cooperation using superordinate goals. To combat conflict between groups, focus on big, compelling global challenges, climate change, pandemics, maybe even space exploration, things that require cooperation across divides. International agreements, cultural exchange, they're tools for building shared identity and trust. And finally, perhaps most critically, forge that new social contract with the planet. We have to update our global rules to reflect ecological reality. That means shifting from seeing nature as property to recognizing the rights of nature, making ecosystems partners in survival. codifying stewardship and regeneration into law, building a circular economy, creating a truly sustainable relationship.
Wow. So this deep dive really shows that the human algorithm for things to work well, whether it's a family or the whole planet, it rests on three pillars. Rules need to be just and clear. They need to be grounded in our shared biological and psychological nature, and they need to be aligned with the long-term health of the whole interconnected system, the individual, the group, and the planet.
Exactly. A failure in any one of those things. Justice, our nature, or alignment with the whole system seems to inevitably lead to instability, conflict, decay. But getting it right across all three, that's what's like the formula for a healthy, educated, prosperous society living in balance with its environment.
So what stands out to you now, listening to this, about the rules governing your own life, your community, the world? How might you think about them differently now, knowing their deep evolutionary, psychological, historical roots? The profound meaning behind this whole human project, creating rules, following them, criticizing them, trying to perfect them, it really seems to be about nothing less than building a better future, one rule at a time.
This is DigitView.